Sherlock Holmes and the portrait that watched back, a portrait that watched, and a secret it refused to hide. Welcome to Silent Case File. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your comments make these mysteries come alive. Let's begin. It was on a wind-lashed October evening, the kind that ushered in the kindling of hearths and the drawing of curtains across London, when the case first arrived at 221B Baker Street in the form of a knock, timid, rapid, and irregular. Holmes had been in a languid state all day, sprawled across the settee, his violin untouched beside him, and the newspapers of the past week strewn across the floor like discarded clues from a solved crime. I myself had been reading a monograph on tropical diseases, a habit I maintained from my military days, when the doorbell below rang out and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps pattered to admit a visitor. "Someone in a desperate state," Holmes murmured without looking up. "You deduce that from the sound of the bell?" "No, Watson, from the rhythm of the knock. Desperation makes men clumsy and redundant. You will note that there were 4 knocks, 2 fast, 1 pause, then another 2. Repetition is often a plea for urgency." Before I could offer a counterpoint, the sitting-room door swung open, and in stepped a young man of perhaps 26, rein on his shoulders and a feverish look in his eyes. His overcoat was of good tailoring, but showed signs of having been worn hastily. He clutched a flat package wrapped in brown paper, which trembled slightly in his hands. "You must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said. "Please, forgive the hour. I had nowhere else to go." Holmes, ever the observer, glanced once at the man, then pointed him to the chair nearest the fire. "You are most welcome, sir," Holmes said, his voice brisk. "Your name, occupation, and the reason you are being followed by a man in a fur-lined cloak who stood just outside our building for no less than 7 minutes." The young man stared, open-mouthed. "My name is Piers Rivington. I work at the Marlbrook Institute of Fine Arts. I don't know anything about being followed unless it's because of this." He held out the package. Holmes unwrapped it with care, revealing a portrait of a woman rendered in oil. The painting was of exquisite craftsmanship, showing a woman of perhaps 30 years, with a pale complexion, striking grey eyes and auburn hair, pinned in a Victorian coiffure. There was an eerie stillness in her expression, calm and noble, but her eyes seemed unsettlingly aware. Watson, ever attuned to sensation over deduction, leaned closer. "There's something peculiar about the way she stares out. It's almost—" I searched for the word. "Sentient." "Yes," Rivington said quickly. "That's precisely it. Everyone says so." Holmes examined the painting in silence for a long moment, then turned his attention back to Rivington. "Start at the beginning," Rivington swallowed. "The portrait is known as Lady Charmaine Ashcroft, 1873. It arrived anonymously at the Institute 6 days ago. No letter, no provenance. The art director, Miss Evangeline Prowse, initially dismissed it as a hoax, but the technique, it's extraordinary. Brushwork consistent with late pre-Raphaelite forms, the varnish age-appropriate, and under magnification even the craquelure suggests authenticity." "And yet," Holmes prompted. Rivington's voice dropped. "Something is wrong with it. 3 staff members have seen strange things. One claimed the eyes followed him across the room. Another said he heard whispering while cataloguing it. Miss Prowse herself disappeared 2 nights ago." Holmes's brow rose. "Disappeared?" "Vanished entirely. She left her flat in Bloomsbury at 7:30, presumably to dine with a friend, but never arrived. Her umbrella was found broken in an alley near Charing Cross, along with one of her gloves. The police think she simply ran off, but I don't believe that. And then yesterday, someone tried to steal the portrait from the storage room. It was bolted shut from the inside." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes remained impassive. So a portrait with no history which allegedly moves, a missing curator, a break-in without entry, and an unknown party shadowing you. Rivington nodded miserably. Yes, that's why I brought the portrait here. I didn't know who else to turn to. Holmes rose and walked slowly to the portrait, examining it again with new intent. He fetched a magnifying glass and, after adjusting the gaslight for proper illumination, inspected the canvas millimetre by millimetre. After several minutes, he gave a soft hum. The technique is real, but the subject... He turned suddenly. Watson, what do you make of her expression? Tranquil, perhaps noble? Look again. No, use the lamp. There now, the corners of the mouth, the tension around the brows. I looked closer. There's something restrained about it, as though she's concealing something. It's not serenity, it's suppressed emotion. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. Just then a sharp rap sounded at the window pane. We turned. Rivington leapt up. Holmes crossed to the curtain, threw it aside and threw open the sash. The fog had thickened considerably, but for a fleeting second I could just make out the figure of a man in a long dark coat, standing motionless in the mist before vanishing into the alley. A watcher indeed, Holmes said quietly. He turned back into the room, drawing the curtains closed behind him. Mr. Rivington, you are not to return to your residence tonight, Watson, if you'd be so kind as to make up the spare room for our guest. And the painting? I asked. Holmes's gaze returned to the portrait. It stays. For tonight at least we shall let Lady Charmaine watch us as we sleep. Perhaps she will tell me what secrets she holds by morning. And with that curious remark, Holmes seated, himself by the fire, fingers steepled, eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. And something else. Interest, yes, but also caution. The case had begun. The morning dawned grey and reluctant, and I awoke to find Holmes already dressed and seated before the portrait, his gaze fixed so intently upon it that I initially wondered whether he'd remained in that same position through the night. The rain had lessened to a misting drizzle, casting the windows in a fine sheen and making the fire in our hearth all the more inviting. He did not turn as I approached, but spoke as though continuing a conversation already begun. You notice, Watson, that the brushstrokes around the eyes differ from the rest of the portrait. I rubbed the sleep from my own and looked closer. I confess I see only very fine work. Haunting, yes, but surely consistent. Not quite, he replied. Observe the irises, see the glint there in the left eye. It is more pronounced than in the right, almost unnatural. A mere artistic flourish, one might argue, until you realize it is a touch of varnish laid atop dry pigment, added later, intentionally. I bent nearer. He was right, the glint was slightly raised, catching light in a way the rest of the painting did not. Someone altered the portrait, I said. Or perhaps someone enhanced it for effect, but why? That is the question which has kept me company through the night. At that moment, Rivington entered, looking slightly better for the night's rest, but still pale. He offered us both a polite nod and then glanced at the portrait with a sort of helpless dread, as though expecting it to whisper a warning. Holmes rose briskly. Mr. Rivington, a few questions before we breakfast. Did Miss Prowse ever mention receiving threats or any correspondence related to this portrait? Nothing that I'm aware of, Rivington said. She was excited by the painting at first. We all were. It's quite rare to have an unsigned work of such quality simply arrive at our doorstep. But by the second or third day her tone changed. She grew anxious, distracted. She began locking it away in the storage vault before she left each night. Did she suggest it had some connection to a real person? No, though she wondered aloud whether the portrait might have been deliberately hidden for a reason. She even speculated, half in jest, I thought, that it had the look of a deathbed commission. She was researching the Ashcroft family, thinking it might be a member of their line. Holmes paused at this. Ashcroft. Not an uncommon name, but of interest nonetheless. And what of the man I saw last night? Do you still claim no knowledge of him? Rivington shook his head. None. I haven't had dealings with anyone that might warrant being followed. I haven't even told anyone I brought the portrait here. Then it is not you he follows, but the painting, Holmes mused. And that is a far more interesting prospect. I was about to ask what he intended to do next, when Holmes, in his usual manner, shifted suddenly from conversation to action. He reached for his coat and cane, gesturing toward the door. Watson, you will accompany me. Mr. Rivington, I suggest you remain here and avoid the windows. The painting is safest under this roof. If anything unusual occurs, signal Mrs. Hudson and she shall fetch us. We set out into the damp streets of London, weaving through fog and smoke toward the Marlbrook Institute. Though I was no stranger to Holmes's sudden excursions, I had to quicken my pace to keep stride with him this time, for he moved with evident purpose. You believe Miss Prowse's disappearance is tied to the painting? I asked as we walked. Not merely tied, Watson, precipitated. The sequence is too tight. The painting arrives, disturbances follow, a staff member vanishes, and then someone attempts to retrieve the painting. This is not superstition, it is orchestration. The Marlbrook Institute stood as a proud edifice of brick and stone, its broad steps flanked by two statues of muses worn down by time and soot. Inside, we were greeted by a Mr. Langley, the deputy director, a gaunt man with a perpetually worried brow. I was told you might be coming, Mr. Holmes, he said. The police have been no help. They assume Miss Prowse ran off to Paris with some suitor. She didn't. She'd never do such a thing without telling someone. Holmes inclined his head. Mr. Langley, I require access to Miss Prowse's office, the room where the painting was stored, and a list of the Institute's benefactors. Langley blinked. The benefactors? I believe this painting was meant to reach someone here, perhaps not Miss Prowse at all. We were shown first into Miss Prowse's office, a tidy space with stacks of correspondence, catalogues, and art journals arranged with methodical care. Holmes immediately moved to the desk and began examining the letters with gloved fingers. He paused at a pale blue envelope. Aha! He held it out for me to read. The writing was elegant, the script refined. My dear Miss Prowse, you have something that belongs in silence. Return it to where it came from and all will be well. The eyes have seen too much. L, no signature? No return address? The eyes, Holmes murmured. It would seem others believe this portrait has watched more than it should. We next proceeded to the storage room, a secure basement chamber lined with steel racks and canvas covers. Holmes examined the lock and hinges. New scratches, he noted, running his hand across the bolt. And powder residue. Gunpowder, no doubt used to force the hinge before retreating. But something stopped them. Likely, the painting was already gone. He stood still for a moment, then strode toward the back of the room, where an antique wardrobe stood. The doors opened easily. Nothing but old drapery within. But Holmes reached for a seam in the floor and pressed. With a low groan, a panel slid aside to reveal a narrow crawl space, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Holmes didn't hesitate. Wait here, Watson. He vanished into the gloom. I stood watch for several minutes before he emerged, brushing cobwebs from his shoulders. It leads nowhere. A bolt hole. Someone else knew of it and used it, but not recently. Dust was undisturbed until last night. We returned upstairs where Holmes examined the list of benefactors. One name caught his eye. Lord Almeric Ashcroft. "Ashcroft again?" he said. "And resident of Hampstead. Curious." Langley nodded. "He made a large donation 2 years ago, rare medieval manuscripts. Hasn't set foot in the Institute since." Holmes turned to me. "I believe we've found the next thread, Watson." He turned to Langley. "Do you possess any records of where the painting came from? Any detail at all about the delivery?" Langley hesitated. "Only a receipt from a hired cart. I believe it was from Islington." "Then we must pay a visit to both places. First, the Ashcroft estate, and then, if we find nothing, Islington." He thanked Langley with a perfunctory nod and led us back into the street. The fog had begun to lift, but Holmes's face had grown graver with each step. "There is something more to this than art, forgery, or superstition," he said under his breath. "This painting was sent with purpose and not for display. It was a message, possibly a warning." "A warning to whom?" I asked. "To Miss Prowse, perhaps, or to Lord Ashcroft, or, most troubling of all, to whoever dares look too closely into the eyes of Lady Charmaine." We turned eastward as the bells of St. Mary-le-Bow tolled noon behind us, and a gust of wind carried the scent of damp stone and chimney smoke through the city. Somewhere, I felt sure, the portrait watched still, its eyes carrying knowledge we had not yet earned. By the time we arrived in Hampstead, the weather had grown clearer, but the streets still glistened with the morning's rain. The Ashcroft residence stood upon a gentle rise, a grand but slightly dilapidated house, veiled in ivy, its tall windows gazing out over the foggy distance like weary eyes that had seen too much. A butler, in full livery, admitted us after Holmes presented his card, and we were shown through a sombre hallway lined with antique portraits into a drawing-room dimly lit by the overcast sky. Lord Almeric Ashcroft entered with deliberate slowness. He was a man of advanced age, perhaps in his 70s, with long, bony hands and a pale, parchment-like complexion. His bearing retained something of aristocratic pride, though his body had clearly begun to betray him. He leaned heavily on a cane and wore a grey smoking jacket with a silk cravat tucked into his collar. His eyes, however, were still sharp and retained a glint that suggested his mind had not similarly weakened. "Mr. Holmes," he said, with quiet authority, "you are either here about my cousin's wretched duel in Turin, or something much more modern and equally disagreeable. Given your reputation, I suspect the latter." Holmes offered a slight bow. "You are quite correct, Lord Ashcroft. I've come regarding a portrait, one believed to depict Lady Charmaine Ashcroft, dated 1873. The old man stilled. For the briefest instant, something flickered across his face, shock perhaps, or dread, quickly suppressed. "I thought that portrait was destroyed," he said finally, his voice colder. "It was meant to be." "Yet it found its way to the Marlbrook Institute," Holmes replied calmly. "6 days ago, anonymously, and already it has caused at least one disappearance. I presume you refer to the woman curator." "Yes, I read something in the Chronicle." He sank into a high-backed chair and gazed into the fire. "I never knew the painter, but I know the subject. Charmaine was my brother's wife, a brilliant, difficult woman. She died under unfortunate circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" I asked. "Allegedly of a fever. But there were whispers, of course. My brother, Richard, was prone to drink and darker moods. He was accused of striking her once in a drunken rage. Nothing proved. Nothing ever is in houses such as this. And the portrait? I had it burned, or so I thought. My brother had commissioned it after her death, out of guilt, I suspect. He was obsessed with preserving her image, But the artist, some Frenchman name lost to time, captured something uncanny in her expression, as though she were watching him paint. I remember the moment I saw it unveiled. I hated it. Everyone did. Her likeness was too perfect, too knowing. My brother hung it in his study, and soon after, he took his own life. "Gunshot?" Holmes asked softly. "Indeed." There was a heavy pause. The fire crackled and hissed, filling the silence as the older man stared into the flames. Holmes spoke again, his voice low. "Then perhaps you understand, Lord Ashcroft, why I must ask. Is there anyone who might wish to unearth that past now? Anyone who might benefit from dredging up Lady Charmaine's memory and sending her image into public view?" The old man's expression grew hard. "You mean blackmail? Or revenge? Quite possibly. There are bastards enough in the family line. But I've paid off all who dared try, and as for Richard's affairs, any misdeeds he committed died with him, as they should have." "You're quite certain of that?" "I am. I suggest you leave the portrait to rot, Mr. Holmes. If you're wise, you'll burn it yourself this time." Holmes inclined his head, but I could see the look in his eyes. He had no intention of doing anything of the sort. As we were ushered out, Holmes paused in the hall to glance at one of the family portraits. It was a small oil painting of a young man in military dress. "Richard Ashcroft?" he inquired. The butler nodded. "Yes, sir. That was painted in India, 1869. Holmes murmured a thank you, and we stepped once more into the damp London air. As we descended toward the street, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent for a time, his eyes trained on some inward thread. I let him be, knowing that when the strands of his mind connected, they did so with astonishing clarity. At last he spoke. "You recall, Watson, that Rivington mentioned Miss Prowse was researching the Ashcroft family. That implies she found something worth finding. The family has buried its past, yet the portrait resurfaces, not just as art, but as a catalyst." "You think the painting was meant as a message to Lord Ashcroft?" "Possibly. Or a message to whoever recognizes what it truly depicts. The expression, yes, it is unnerving. But the glint in the eye, the varnish laid over pigment, the late alteration, that suggests a hidden detail. A cipher, perhaps. Something only visible under the right conditions." We caught a cab and began making our way toward Islington. Holmes tapped his cane softly on the floor as he spoke. "I want to find the man who delivered the portrait to the Institute. He may not know who sent it, but he might recall who paid him, or from where it was collected." The cab rattled through muddy streets until we came upon a narrow mews lined with stable houses and warehouses. Holmes led us to a carting company, a small brick building marked Fairley and Sons, deliveries arranged, and spoke to a grizzled clerk behind the desk. "We'd like to know who arranged a delivery to the Marlborough Institute 6 days ago. A painting, large, wrapped." The clerk blinked, then reached under the counter and produced a leather logbook. After a moment of flipping, he stopped and jabbed a finger on a line. "Here we are. Pick up from Redbridge Yard, paid in cash, delivered by young Alf. He's on midday break. You'll find him across the street at the tea stall." We crossed over and indeed found Alf, no older than 18, with a freckled face and a straw-coloured cap, nursing a scalding mug of tea. Holmes wasted no time. "The portrait you delivered to Marlborough, do you recall where exactly you collected it?" "Big crate, that one. Real awkward. From the old granary just off Redbridge Lane. No address, just told to meet a man there." "Describe him?" Alf frowned. "Tall, bit stooped, wore a scarf and hat, but I'd say foreign, not English. He gave me 2 sovereigns for quick delivery and told me not to open the box, didn't say more." Holmes pressed him for the precise location of the handoff, then handed over a shilling. "Thank you, my boy. You've helped more than you know." As we turned to leave, Holmes muttered, "Redbridge Lane? Industrial wasteland. If ever a place concealed secrets, it is there." I followed him back into the cab, the sky now turning a pale silver overhead. "So," I said, "we have a portrait that seems to haunt, a nobleman who tried to erase it, a vanished curator, and a foreign figure delivering the piece in secret." Holmes nodded, "And we have yet to understand what the painting hides. But mark my words, Watson, someone wanted it seen, and someone else wanted it buried. Between those two wills, the truth lies." As we headed east, I glanced at Holmes, his eyes bright, his hands steepled, and I knew we were only at the beginning. For though the eyes of Lady Charmaine did not move in the frame, it was becoming increasingly clear they had seen and remembered far more than anyone dared admit. The Redbridge granary stood on the edge of Islington like an abandoned sentinel, 3 stories of soot-blackened brick, its boarded windows like shut eyes, and its slate roof bowed in the middle as if weighed down by secrets. Holmes and I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun beginning to pierce the clouds with a half-hearted glow. The surrounding lane was empty, save for a few scraggly cats, and the odd puddle left from the previous night's rain. Holmes paused before the great wooden doors and examined the iron lock, which hung askew from a chain that had clearly been cut recently. "Someone else has been here," he murmured. "Possibly the same man who paid the cart driver. Let us see what he left behind." The inside smelled of damp grain, cold stone, and the faint must of oil paint. The ground floor was largely empty, though the imprints of a large crate were still visible in the dust, evidence, no doubt, of the portrait's former resting place. Broken boards creaked underfoot as we explored, Holmes's sharp gaze flicking across every beam and surface. In one corner he knelt to examine a patch of floor where something had clearly been burned. Only a faint black ring remained. "A candle," he said, "likely set on the floor, and here, scraps of sealing wax. Someone was tampering with something, perhaps resealing a container, not merely delivering a painting, Watson, preparing it." He rose and motioned toward the stairwell. The second floor was dim and narrow, the ceiling sloped. Here were remnants of what had once been workers' quarters, a rusted bed frame, a shattered mirror, and discarded papers yellowed with age. Holmes stepped over a fallen beam and made for the far end, where an old ledger lay beneath a tarp. He flipped it open, scanned the pages, and smiled faintly. Invoices from 1873, the year the portrait was supposedly painted. Look, Ashcroft shipments. Richard Ashcroft leased this space briefly, it seems, for storing something marked only as personal effects. A beat passed, then Holmes looked up. "It is possible, Watson, that the portrait never left this building, that it was hidden here, sealed away for decades, and only recently rediscovered. But by whom? That is the question, and we are not alone in asking."
It! A sound broke the silence, a muffled scuff from the stairs below. Holmes raised a finger to his lips and stepped quickly into the shadows behind a wooden partition. I followed suit, flattening myself against the wall just as the door creaked open. 2 men entered the room. One tall and lean, wearing a foreign-cut coat and dark leather gloves. The other was smaller, wiry, with a cap pulled low over his brow. Their conversation was hushed, but tense. "I told you we shouldn't have left the wax," the smaller man hissed. "Quiet! They're already sniffing around. We must retrieve what was left." "What if it's gone?" "Then we follow the detective. Holmes, is it not?" Holmes' eyebrows lifted slightly in the gloom. He gestured for me to remain still. The tall man moved toward the burned ring on the floor and knelt to examine it. "Still fresh. No one's taken it yet." The smaller man shifted uneasily. We could torch the place, that'd end it for good. No, that will bring attention. We do this quiet. They turned to leave, but Holmes stepped forward abruptly, cane raised. Gentlemen, he said crisply, how unfortunate to find you trespassing, or perhaps you'd prefer the term retracing. The taller man froze, then stood slowly. You shouldn't be here, Mr. Holmes. I might say the same for you, but as you are here, you might enlighten me as to what precisely it is you hope to retrieve? The man's face was unreadable. It is not ours to reveal. Then perhaps Scotland Yard will persuade you. But in that moment the smaller man lunged, producing a small knife from beneath his coat. Before I could react, Holmes had sidestepped cleanly, grabbing a loose timber from the floor and striking the man's wrist with just enough force to disarm. The knife clattered to the floor. The taller man did not resist. Instead, he raised his hands and said softly, "We are not enemies, Mr. Holmes, at least not of the law. But the painting you chase belongs to a very old story, one that was meant to die with the past." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "A story connected to Richard Ashcroft?" The man gave a bitter smile. "To Charmaine Ashcroft and the artist who painted her." Holmes paused. "The artist?" "You will not find his name in any gallery or catalogue. He was not merely a painter, Mr. Holmes. He was a confidant, a confessor, and he painted the truth." With that cryptic remark, the man turned and walked back into the stairwell, the other staggering behind him, clutching his wrist. Holmes did not follow. Instead, he knelt again at the burned mark on the floor. They were searching for something left behind, something used in sealing or hiding the portrait. He pulled out his magnifying lens and inspected the boards, then stood. "Come, Watson, there is more to be learned at Baker Street. I must examine the portrait again, more carefully this time." We returned before
dusk. Rivington met us at the door, his expression anxious. "I had the feeling someone was watching from across the street," he said. "A man with a limp, standing near the lamp-post. He vanished as I opened the curtain." Holmes made no reply but strode immediately to the sitting-room. The portrait still stood on its easel near the fire, Lady Charmaine's gaze locked upon us with that same eerie composure. Holmes lit the gas lamps, turned down the shades, and fetched a small case from the cabinet. Inside was a phial of lemon juice, a tiny brush, and a small silver heating lamp. "Watson," he said, "when I examined the varnish last night, I noted a slight unevenness, too subtle for casual inspection, but suggesting an overlayer." He dipped the brush into the lemon juice and gently applied it to the lower left corner of the painting. Then, using the heating lamp, he hovered a flame nearby until the treated area began to glow faintly. And then letters appeared, faint, pale against the canvas, but letters all the same. Handwritten in an elegant scrawl just beneath the painted folds of the subject's gown. He knew, but he painted me anyway. "The truth lives in the light." Rivington gasped aloud. "A hidden inscription," Holmes nodded. "Not uncommon in works of art, but this one was deliberately obscured, sealed beneath layers. The artist meant it to be found eventually, but only by someone who knew to look." I bent nearer. "What does it mean? The truth lives in the light?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "It may be literal or symbolic, but I would wager that under the right light, perhaps ultraviolet, perhaps angled sunlight, something else may reveal itself in the portrait." He fetched a small prism from the windowsill, held it before the lamp, and shifted the beam across the canvas. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, something began to shimmer in the upper right, beneath the painted background of dark curtain folds. Another shape, a figure, ghost-like, barely visible, hidden in layers of shadowy pigment. The outline of a man, half obscured, standing behind the woman's chair. his face vague, but unmistakably present. "A second figure," I whispered. "Yes," Holmes said softly. "The painter placed him there intentionally, and I would wager that man is Richard Ashcroft." Rivington stared. "But then, that means the portrait wasn't painted posthumously, it was painted before her death." "Or during," Holmes said. "Which raises an interesting question. If Richard commissioned the portrait after her death, then either he lied or someone else painted this. Someone who was there when Charmaine died." Holmes turned to me, his voice sharper now. "Watson, tomorrow we go to the archives. I want everything written about Charmaine Ashcroft's death. Medical reports, obituaries, legal documents, if any, exist, and the name of any painter in Richard Ashcroft's circle. Do you believe she
"Was murdered?" I asked. Holmes glanced once more at the second figure in the shadows, his brow tight with thought. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the portrait holds a confession, and that someone is willing to kill again to prevent us from hearing it." Lady Charmaine's eyes, ever fixed upon us, offered no confirmation, but something in her painted stare now seemed less passive, more urgent, and I could not shake the feeling that we had only begun to unearth what she had been trying all these years to say. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. The fog of the past days lifted as though to mark the clarity Holmes sought in the deepening mystery. We breakfasted in haste. Holmes merely toyed with his poached eggs before setting out for the London Metropolitan Archives. His mood was one of restless energy. He tapped his fingers on the armrest of our hansom cab as though conducting a silent fugue, eyes half closed, yet clearly alight within a calculation. "The key," he said, not for the first time, "is not the painting, Watson. It is the painter. The one who saw what no one else was meant to see and who dared preserve it." "You still believe the portrait was painted during Charmaine Ashcroft's life?" "I believe it shows more than a lifeless image," Holmes replied. "The subtle tension in her mouth, the minute shift of posture, it is not the still repose of death, but the quiet endurance of someone very much alive and very much aware." At the archives, we were received by a clerk who recognized Holmes instantly and brought us directly to the relevant records. In silence, we pored over brittle sheets and registry books, sifting the dusty detritus of the past. The death certificate of Lady Charmaine Ashcroft, dated October 17th, 1873, gave the cause as malarial fever, acquired during a family holiday to the Tyrol region of Austria. The attending physician was noted as Dr. Sylvester Roke, a familiar name to Holmes. "Roke," he murmured. "A society doctor in those days, more politician than physician. He treated the wealthy and discreetly certified what they needed certified." The obituary from the Times was equally unsatisfying. "A lady of refinement and charm," it read, "survived by her husband Richard Ashcroft, who continues to mourn her passing in private." No mention of any controversy, no hint of suspicion. But in the estate ledger dated just 1 month after her death, a line item appeared under miscellaneous household disbursements, 200 os paid to Monsieur Vanier. Holmes tapped the name. "There, that is our artist." "Vanier?" I repeated. Michel Vanier, a French painter who briefly exhibited in Paris in the late 1860s, known for his intimate domestic portraits, though his name vanished after 1872. I remember the reviews of a scandal surrounding him, a nobleman's wife, whispered affairs, a portrait hidden. It would appear he resurfaced here, under the patronage of
Richard Ashcroft, and then disappeared again? Very likely, perhaps forcibly. We requested any travel records or immigration files under that name, but they revealed little. One steamer record listed a M. Vanier departing London for Marseille in 1874, but with no listed profession. It was circumstantial at best. Back on Baker Street by noon, we found Rivington pacing before the fireplace like a man haunted by a dream half-remembered. I must show you something," he said, producing a slim black notebook from his satchel. "This belonged to Miss Prowse. She always carried it. The police overlooked it when they searched her flat. I had a spare key and retrieved it last night." Holmes opened the notebook with care. Each page was filled in her neat script, observations, reflections, notations regarding recent acquisitions to the Institute. Most entries were mundane until we reached the final pages. The varnish is inconsistent. Underscoring beneath the eyes suggests an original layer now obscured, possibly symbolic. In researching Lady Ashcroft's death, I find nothing but silence. One article from a Vienna paper suggested she was seen 2 weeks after the declared date. But no one in London mentioned this. Someone followed me today. I am certain. A man with a limp. He waited outside the Institute and again near the bookshop. The painting unsettles me. It's not just her gaze, it's what lies behind her. Holmes tapped the word behind. "She saw it too," he said, "even before I did." He closed the notebook. Miss Prowse was closer to the truth than she realized. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson knocked, bearing a small envelope with no stamp. "This just arrived, sir. No one saw who brought it." Holmes opened it with a paper knife. Inside was a single card. On it were the words, written in slanting script: "Return the portrait to Ashcroft Hall, or suffer the same silence that claimed the woman who pried too far." Rivington paled. "That must mean Miss Prowse." Holmes's eyes had narrowed. "And whoever wrote this knows the truth is unravelling. We have little time." He stood abruptly. "Watson, we must return to the portrait. Now. I must examine every inch of it for a signature, a symbol, anything Vanier may have left. If he risked painting the truth, he may have risked leaving more." Back in the sitting room, Holmes pulled the easel closer to the window where the afternoon sun cast stronger light. He took up his magnifying lens and worked in silence for nearly half an hour, scanning the folds of the painted fabric, the curve of Lady Charmaine's hands, the background shadows. Then he froze. "Here," he murmured, "just beneath her right hand, faint, but visible if you know where to look." I bent closer. There, painted in a tone only a shade darker than the skin, was a single word: "Confitia." "Latin?" I said. "I confess." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "And written in Vanier's distinctive hand. He has marked this painting not as art, but as testimony." He stepped back. "The story is becoming clear. Vanier painted Lady Charmaine not at the request of her grieving husband, but at her request, possibly in secret. The portrait was meant to reveal the truth. Perhaps she feared for her life. Perhaps she had uncovered something about Richard Ashcroft or had suffered at his hands. Either way, she wanted the world to see. But why wait all these years? I asked. Why does it surface now? Holmes turned toward the fireplace, face taut. Because someone failed to destroy it, someone who found it recently, perhaps while clearing old properties or while digging through the Ashcroft estate, and realized it still posed a threat. He looked at Rivington. You said Miss Prowse was searching for genealogical links? Yes, she was curious about how Lady Charmaine's family had vanished so completely. There were no heirs, no surviving sisters, nothing, as if the family had been erased. Holmes nodded slowly, which suggests a deliberate purge, not just of the woman, but of her legacy. At that moment, a loud knock came at the door, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs. Lestrade burst in, his expression drawn. "Holmes! Bad business in Bloomsbury. They found Miss Prowse in a derelict cellar 2 streets from her flat." My heart sank. "She's dead then?" I asked. Lestrade gave a grim nod. "Yes, strangled. Been there for days, maybe more. We only found her because a landlord reported a terrible smell." He glanced at the painting. "That thing, it's cursed, isn't it?" Holmes gave him a long look. "Not cursed, Lestrade, witness. And someone is desperate to destroy what it has seen." He turned back to us, his voice cold and sure. "We are no longer dealing with a simple art forgery or even a historical mystery. This is a murder case, then and now. And the painting is both evidence and motive." He stepped forward, facing Lady Charmaine's portrait one more time. "She tried to speak through this image. It is up to us now to listen." Outside, the bells of St. Paul's began to toll the hour, slow and solemn. And within that darkened room, beneath the gaze of painted eyes that would not look away, we stood in silence, knowing the game had changed and that death had returned to finish what it once began. The evening found us once again in the study at Baker Street, where the dimming light of day seemed to deepen the already unnerving presence of the portrait. Lady Charmaine's gaze, neither accusatory nor pleading, but something uncomfortably in between, seemed to observe the unfolding drama with passive certainty. Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled, the tips pressed to his lips in uncharacteristic stillness. "You believe Richard Ashcroft murdered her?" I said quietly. The crackling hearth, the only other sound in the room. Holmes nodded once. Or at the very least that he drove her to fear for her life. Perhaps he wished to silence a secret, one she encoded in this painting. But the motive is secondary for now. Our priority is to trace the painting's journey. Whoever unearthed it recently is the key to this revival of old crimes and to the death of Miss Prowse. He rose and paced, more restless than before. The threats sent to Rivington and the Institute suggest the culprit believes the painting still poses a danger. That means we're closing in. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson knocked gently and entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it, unfolded the crisp paper, and read silently. "It's from Wiggins," he said, referring to the sharp-eyed leader of his irregulars. He followed the man with the limp who loitered near the Institute, traced him to a boarding house near Limehouse. The man rented under the name Henri Dupont. Undoubtedly an alias. Paid in cash, left this morning. Destination unknown. "Then we've lost him," I said. "Not entirely," Holmes replied. Wiggins pilfered a piece of discarded correspondence from the man's bin. "It's en route here now. We may yet find our thread." A sharp rapping at the window startled us both. Holmes crossed and opened it to admit a breathless Wiggins, a wiry boy of 13 with a muddy scarf and ink-stained fingers. He handed over a folded scrap of paper. Holmes examined it carefully. The note was torn at the edges but legible. "Delivered to G. Mornay, Rose Lane Warehouse. Contents, canvas, sealed, handled discreetly, payment upon receipt. G. Mornay," Holmes muttered. "A name we've not yet heard, but Rose Lane is not far, near the old dockyards." He turned to me. "Put on your coat, Watson. We're paying a visit tonight, before another piece of this puzzle vanishes into the Thames." The cab ride was short and brisk, and the London night had sharpened into a chill. By the time we reached Rose Lane, the fog had returned in thin tendrils that clung to the alleyways like ghosts. The warehouse in question was a squat brick structure, the windows boarded and a rusting lock on the main doors. Holmes examined the area with his lantern and quickly found a back entrance, latched only by a chain looped through a bent nail. Inside, the air was damp with mildew and old fish oil. The floorboards creaked with age. Crates were stacked in disorderly piles, many bearing faded French customs stamps. Holmes moved swiftly methodically checking labels. "Here," he whispered, shining his light on a crate marked Mornay, Objets d'art. The lid was loose. He pried it open with his knife, and inside lay a large flat package wrapped in waxed canvas, bound tightly with twine. Carefully, Holmes peeled the wrapping away to reveal another portrait. But this one was not of Charmaine Ashcroft. It depicted a man, middle-aged, gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his lips pursed as, though he had just finished speaking and was caught mid-thought. The background was plain, the colour palette muted. In the bottom right corner, in faded crimson, was the signature, Monsieur Vanier. "A second painting," I murmured. "Another by the same hand." Holmes' expression grew hard. "Yes, and note the date," he pointed. Below the signature were the digits, 1874, a year after Charmaine's supposed death, Holmes said. "And look here, there's damage." Indeed, a deep tear ran across the lower third of the painting through the figure's chest. It had been clumsily patched with linen on the reverse. Holmes tilted the frame toward the lantern light and held up his magnifying glass. "Look closely, Watson. The man's likeness. Thin, yes, but the bone structure. It's Richard Ashcroft." "But the portrait was painted after Charmaine died. That's impossible." Holmes turned to me. "Not if he faked her death and Vanier discovered it." I stared. "You mean Charmaine was alive after October 1873? "It's possible," Holmes said. "What if she went into hiding or fled after attempting to leave her husband? Perhaps Vanier helped her, perhaps he painted the portrait before she disappeared. And this second portrait was meant to expose Richard. But it never saw daylight. It was damaged, hidden, perhaps stolen by someone loyal to Ashcroft." He reached into the crate and pulled out a folded paper that had been lodged behind the canvas. It was brittle and faintly stained, written in French. To those who find this, I was wrong to remain silent. She came to me for protection, but I could not save her. Her husband deceived the world and buried the truth beneath coin and fire. I leave this likeness as a final witness. If justice is ever sought, let it begin with her face. Michel Vanier, March 1874. A long silence fell between us. Holmes read it again, then said quietly, "That confirms it. Vanier knew what Richard Ashcroft had done. He tried to preserve the truth in paint, but someone got to him and to the canvas before he could speak." Suddenly footsteps echoed outside, firm, approaching fast. Holmes extinguished the lantern and pulled me behind a stack of crates. The door creaked. A beam of light swept the interior. Two men entered. One of them was the limping figure we'd seen before, Dupont, if that was indeed his name. The other was heavier set, with a hat pulled low, and a revolver in his gloved hand. "Too late," Dupont muttered. "The crate's been opened." "We torched the place," the second man said. "No more chances." Holmes drew his own revolver silently and gestured for me to stay hidden. He stepped out from behind the crate with lethal calm. "I would strongly advise against fire." Both men froze. The second man raised his pistol, but Holmes's aim was faster. "Drop it, now!" The revolver clattered to the floor. Dupont didn't move, though his eyes narrowed with fury. Holmes stepped forward. "You've come a long way to destroy the past, but it won't burn so easily this time." He turned to me. "Watson, fetch the constable we passed near the docks and have Lestrade sent for. Tell him we've uncovered a second murder." When Lestrade arrived an hour later with a full squad of officers, the men were taken into custody, though neither gave their real names. The warehouse was sealed, the portraits taken under guard to Scotland Yard. Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced long into the night, the fire burning low, Lady Charmaine's portrait still resting in its place by the window. "She wanted someone to see," he said, more to himself than to me. And Vanier was the only one who did. He risked everything to preserve what she couldn't say aloud.
And the men? I asked. What will happen to them? Holmes shrugged. Hired hands. Agents of someone higher. Perhaps a remaining Ashcroft loyalist, or even a descendant. We shall know more when Lestrade puts pressure on them. He stopped before the portrait, folding his hands behind his back. But the truth is now uncovered. Charmaine never died of fever. She was silenced. And Vanier painted her not in mourning, but as a warning. The silence that followed was weighty. We were not merely detectives solving a puzzle. We were, in some small way, the final audience of a woman's desperate attempt to leave behind a testament. Holmes turned at last. Tomorrow, Watson, we go to the Ashcroft family crypt. I want to see whose bones lie in Charmaine Ashcroft's coffin. And for the first time since the case began, I shivered not from cold or fear, but from the knowledge that we were exhuming more than just secrets. We were about to disturb the very foundation of a lie buried in stone. The next morning, we departed early, leaving Baker Street under a veil of heavy grey skies that threatened rain. The hired landau rocked gently beneath us as we travelled northwest toward the Ashcroft family estate, nestled near the sleepy village of Shear, where ivy-covered hills and wind-swept fields held long memories and longer silences. Holmes, cloaked in a long dark coat and scarf, said little during the journey. His gaze was fixed out the window, though I knew his mind was at work, unravelling the strands of deceit that stretched back over 3 decades. The evidence we now possessed, 2 paintings, Vanier's confession, and the attempted destruction of both, had strengthened Holmes's theory into something nearing certainty. And yet there remained one final point of proof he desired, or rather, one final deception he intended to disprove. We arrived at Ashcroft Hall around midday. The once grand manor stood like a relic of faded glory, its gables weather-stained and its gardens grown wild. Though the house had long since been passed on to distant cousins and caretakers, its private chapel and family crypt had remained untouched as per Lord Almeric Ashcroft's instructions. We were met at the rusted iron gates by a bailiff, a solemn fellow named Greaves, who had been notified in advance by Lestrade and granted us limited access. "This way," Greaves said, leading us past the old rose beds toward the chapel, its stained glass windows cloudy with grime. Behind it, set into a low hill, lay a small crypt with a stone door carved with the family crest, 3 stags rearing beneath a crescent moon. Holmes knelt to examine the base of the doorway, brushing away moss and leaves. "No signs of recent tampering," he muttered. "The hinges are stiff with age. That at least bodes well." Greaves unlocked the ironwork and produced a long iron bar, which he and Holmes used to pry the door open with a groan that seemed to echo into the very ground. The air within was cold, stale and damp, heavy with the weight of stillness. A narrow corridor led into a vaulted chamber lined with stone sarcophagi, each marked with a brass plaque. Holmes moved without hesitation to the rear wall, where a single inscription caught the dim light of our lantern: Lady Charmaine Ashcroft, 1851-1873. Beloved, gone too soon. The brass bore a faint green patina. Holmes ran his fingers along its edge. No signs of sealing wax? This was never disturbed after the burial. He nodded once to Greaves. "Help me remove the lid." It took effort. The stone was heavy and the years had not been kind. But at last, with scraping and a final heave, they lifted the lid away. I steeled myself for the grim sight within. Yet what we found was not grim, but confounding. The coffin was empty. Greaves crossed himself and stepped back in alarm. "By God!" Holmes's voice was quiet, just as I suspected. I knelt to inspect the interior. There was no decay, no bones, no cloth, only dust and a scattering of dried petals long withered. "It was staged," I whispered.
A burial in name only. Holmes nodded. A convenient lie for society. Charmaine vanished, and to spare scandal, or worse, Richard declared her dead, paid for a funeral, had a sarcophagus placed here with all the proper trappings, but no body, because she was still alive. And yet she never re-emerged. No, because I fear Richard ensured she never could. He turned to Greaves. You said this crypt was sealed and untouched? Never once opened, sir. Not in all my years. Holmes nodded. Then the secret lay undisturbed until now. Back outside, the rain began to fall in soft drops. We stood beneath the grey canopy of sky, the truth settling on us like the mist. She may have escaped him once, I said slowly. But not for long. Perhaps he found her. Perhaps he silenced her and then made sure her story would vanish with him. Until the painting reappeared, Holmes said, and brought her voice back with it. We returned to London in silence. Holmes was deep in thought, lips pressed, in a tight line, one finger tapping against the handle of his umbrella in measured rhythm. It was not until we reached Baker Street once more and found Lestrade waiting for us in the sitting-room that he spoke again. They cracked under questioning, Lestrade said without preamble. The two men from the warehouse. Turns out Dupont is really Emile Larocque, former smuggler turned hired muscle. The other one's name is Wardell. Both were paid to retrieve the painting and silence anyone who came too close. Their employer? Holmes raised an eyebrow. Lestrade hesitated. Gerard Mornay, the same name we saw on that shipping crate. He's not French, not really. Born Gerard Ashcroft, illegitimate son of Richard Ashcroft and a maid, hidden away, educated abroad, then disowned. When Richard died, he's spent the last 10 years clawing at what he believes is his inheritance. Holmes nodded. So he found the painting? Yes. It turned up during the sale of a dilapidated Ashcroft property in Kent, a forgotten storage house, apparently. Mornay acquired it quietly, and when he realized what it was, he panicked, tried to have it destroyed. When the Marlbrook Institute accepted it, Miss Prowse began asking questions. That's when he sent Larocque and Wardell. And when they failed to retrieve the painting, he had her silenced, I said, my throat tight. Lestrade nodded grimly. He's in custody now, claims it was only meant to be a warning, but Wardell confessed to the murder. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, and Charmaine's body? No sign. Mornay says he doesn't know where she was buried, or if she even was. We may never know. A silence settled over the room. Then Holmes crossed to the portrait of Lady Charmaine, still on its easel. The light outside had dimmed, but the painted eyes still seemed to watch with their quiet intensity. She tried to speak, he said softly. First to Vanier, then to the world, through this canvas. And now at last her story is heard. He turned to Lestrade. Make sure the painting is preserved, not locked away again. Let it hang in the Institute, with the truth made plain. You think the public should know? I think, Holmes said, that silence served the guilty for far too long. Let her be seen. Lestrade nodded and departed. I remained behind as Holmes sat by the fire, thoughtful. She was clever, I said after a time, to use art as her weapon. She had no choice, Holmes replied. In her time, a woman's word against a man like Richard Ashcroft's was worth little, so she used the one medium that couldn't be shouted down, a portrait, painted not in honour, but as indictment. He stood and approached the canvas once more. She left her confession not in letters or diaries, but in shadow and expression, and we finally listened. The fire crackled gently, rain pattered against the window panes, and, though the house was still, I could not shake the feeling that the eyes in the portrait had changed somehow, not in form, of course, but in what they conveyed. no longer warning, but peace. For at last Lady Charmaine Ashcroft had been heard. The following morning, as a pale sun broke through the London clouds, a small crowd assembled beneath the stone arches of the Marlbrook Institute. The gates had not opened to the public yet, but within, preparations were underway to unveil a singular exhibition witness, in oils, the lost portraits of Michel Vanier. It was not a celebratory event, but one touched with reverence and solemnity, for it would mark the first time in over 3 decades that Lady Charmaine Ashcroft's likeness would be seen not as an idle artistic subject, but as the centerpiece of a long-silenced truth. Holmes and I stood at the far end of the main gallery, where the portrait had been mounted with deliberate simplicity. A velvet rope set a respectful distance from the frame, a single brass plaque affixed beneath the canvas. No florid explanation. Just one line, painted by Michel Vanier, 1873, recovered 1905. The truth lives in the light. The figure of Lady Charmaine looked out across the room, her expression unchanged and yet profoundly different in meaning. Now those eyes were understood. Not unsettling, but knowing. Not spectral, but urgent. For the visitors who came, curators, journalists, and a few select patrons of the arts, there was an unspoken understanding that they were in the presence not just of art, but testimony. "I confess, Holmes," I murmured as I gazed at the portrait, "there's something extraordinary in seeing it like this. It feels holy, in a way." He gave a short nod. "Justice, when long delayed, often assumes a sacred character, Watson. But let us not forget, this is not the end, merely the restoration of a voice." At that moment, Rivington approached. His posture was straighter than when we first met him, and though his face bore signs of recent strain, it was clear that something within him had settled. "I wanted to thank you both," he said. This has changed the Institute, and me." Holmes offered a rare smile. "History is never as tidy as we like to imagine, but it can be corrected. You'll make sure the records reflect what we've learned?" "I've written the full provenance of the painting, including Vanier's letter and Lady Charmaine's story," Rivington replied. "It'll be archived properly and publicly." "And the second painting?" I asked. "The one of Richard Ashcroft?" "Under secure storage," he said. "It's damaged, but we'll restore it in time. It's important, I think, to show both sides of what happened." Holmes murmured. "The victim and the perpetrator, the silent and the silencer. Yes. Both belong in the ledger of truth." We were interrupted then by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, looking slightly out of place in his plain suit among the silk cravats and lace-collared patrons. "Holmes," he said, tipping his hat, "the Crown has decided not to pursue charges against Mornay beyond accessory to obstruction and conspiracy to conceal a crime. Wardell, of course, will hang, but Mornay, well, they lack enough to make murder stick." Holmes didn't seem surprised. He may not have committed the original crime, but he perpetuated its silence. That will haunt him more than any prison. "I've arranged for Vanier's name to be properly recorded in the National Register," Lestrade added. "If anyone comes looking, they'll know he lived, and that he told the truth." With that, the inspector took his leave, muttering something about not wanting to be caught standing near too many journalists. Holmes and I lingered for a few minutes more, watching as a well-dressed couple approached the painting with hushed voices. The woman tilted her head and murmured something to her companion, who replied in a whisper, as if afraid to speak too loudly in front of the painted woman. "She's already begun speaking to others," I said. "That," Holmes replied, "was always her intent. We departed the institute shortly after, stepping out into a spring-like day, crisp but no longer cold. As we walked along Marylebone Road, I could sense a shift in Holmes, not overt, but present nonetheless. Something had been settled within him too. "You've solved dozens of murders, Holmes," I said, as we turned toward Baker Street. "But this was different." He was silent for a moment. Then, "Most cases concern facts, timetables, evidence. This one concerned absence, what was missing and why. A vanished woman, a falsified death, a story buried not in haste, but in deliberate, generational silence. The danger was not in what we might uncover, but in whether we'd believe what had long since been forgotten." "And yet," I said, "she left us everything we needed." He smiled faintly. "Yes. In the stillness of a canvas, she wrote her own testimony. We were merely her readers." Back at Baker Street, as the lamps were lit and the clatter of city life resumed, Holmes resumed his seat by the fire, taking up his pipe and reaching for the violin he had not touched in days. A few quiet notes drifted out, melancholy, reflective, and haunting. I sat opposite him, pen in hand, not yet ready to write, but needing to hold the moment in silence. After a while, Holmes spoke again. "There's a curious paradox in this case," he said. "It began with a painting delivered in secret, anonymous, suspicious, even feared, and yet it became the most honest voice in the entire affair." "She couldn't speak," I said. "So she looked and waited." "Yes," Holmes replied. "And now she's been seen." He played a final chord, then lowered the bow and sat back. "You know, Watson, I often scoff at the sentimental tendency to romanticize the dead, but in this instance I make an exception. Lady Charmaine Ashcroft was more than a victim. She was an artist in her own right, her canvas not made with brush and pigment, but with courage and time." I closed my notebook, letting the last words linger. Outside, the lamplighter's pole clinked softly against the glass as he moved from street to street, the flame catching hold and pushing back the dark. And in our sitting room at 221B, beneath the watchful gaze of no one but memory, the story of the portrait that watched back reached its end, not with vengeance, nor with violence, but with the quiet triumph of a truth finally revealed. The days that followed the unveiling at the Marlbrook Institute passed with a kind of reflective quiet, like the hush that comes after the final note of a requiem. The newspapers ran articles with varied degrees of accuracy. Some heralded the rediscovery of Vanier's work as a triumph of lost art, while others leaned breathlessly into the mystery of the ghostly lady who saw too much. Only a handful, most notably The Times, captured the story for what it truly was: the unearthing of a hidden crime and the overdue recognition of a woman silenced not only by her death, but by the apathy of her time. Holmes was characteristically indifferent to the press, while I, flattered perhaps more than was seemly, kept a modest clipping in my journal. He tossed his aside without so much as a glance. Instead, he returned to his usual rhythm: experiments involving rare molds, monographs on tobacco ash, and a brief but spirited duel of intellects with a retired judge over the moral dimensions of forgery. Yet even amid this return to routine, I noticed in Holmes a subtle restlessness that had not yet abated. It was on the fourth morning, while we sat over breakfast, and the soft rain patted the window panes, that he laid down his fork with deliberate care and turned toward me. "Watson," he said, "there is one piece yet unplaced." I looked up from my newspaper. "Which?" "Charmaine Ashcroft's final fate." "You believe she was killed, do you not?" "I do," he replied. "But we have no body, no burial, no name under which she lived, should she have fled. And Gerard Mornay, for all his bravado, did not know where she went. That suggests something peculiar." "Such as?" That someone else, someone closer to her, was responsible for the final concealment. I thought for a moment. Do you mean Vanier? Holmes shook his head. He was a witness, not a conspirator. His last letter was filled with guilt. Had he buried her, he would have confessed it. No, Watson, someone else kept her hidden, possibly even protected her. And I now believe I know who. He stood abruptly and fetched the small notebook we had recovered from Miss Prowse's belongings, the one containing her observations about the painting. He opened it to a page near the middle and pointed to a penciled margin note I had forgotten entirely. Consulted archives at St. Jude's Home for Women, Lambeth. Found reference to a Mrs. Claire Redford arriving November 1873. Quiet, educated, no family. Could it be her? I blinked. She thought Charmaine survived under another name. Holmes nodded. The timing is right. The place remote enough to offer anonymity. And the pseudonym, Redford, a name with no ties to Ashcroft. If Miss Prowse found this reference, she may have begun to investigate further, and that, in turn, could have led our enemies to her. But St. Jude's, I said, surely it's closed by now. Indeed, but its records were transferred to the Church Diocesan Archive. We shall call there this afternoon. By 2 o'clock we were seated in the small, chilly reading room of the Diocesan Archive, an elderly clerk bustling off to retrieve the 1873 registry. Holmes said little during the wait, but his fingers drummed lightly upon the table in that familiar rhythm that always presaged discovery. When the clerk returned, bearing a heavy leather-bound volume, Holmes opened it reverently, as though it might contain the last words of a long-lost witness. He turned to the relevant month, November. His finger traced down the yellowed column until it stopped. There. I leaned in to read. Redford, Claire. Arrived November 4th, 1873, age estimated 22-24, educated, refined, no known relatives, quiet demeanor, medical condition, recovering from nervous collapse, no departure recorded. No departure, I murmured. She never left, Holmes replied, at least not through the front door. He turned another page. And here, correspondence log, February 1874, a letter sent to Michel Vanier, CO Atelier Rousseau, Montmartre, Paris. My heart gave a small leap. She was writing to him? Likely the only person who knew who she truly was. If she sent for him, or confided in him, that would explain his presence in London months after her supposed death. Holmes stood. We must visit St. Jude's. But it's no longer a refuge. Correct. But the building remains. I wish to see it with my own eyes. The journey to Lambeth took little more than an hour, and soon we stood before the weather-worn gates of what had once been St. Jude's Home for Women. A solemn 3-story brick building, its windows now shuttered, and its grounds given over to wild grass and ivy. A faded wooden sign still hung above the archway, its lettering nearly worn away. Holmes found a loose board in the gate and slipped through. I followed somewhat less gracefully. Inside, the air was thick with damp and dust, the remnants of old prayers and faded voices lingering in the stone. The interior had been left largely untouched, abandoned beds, rusted iron sconces, fragments of furniture cast into corners. Holmes moved through it with unerring focus until he came to the rear wing, where a series of narrow rooms had once served as individual quarters. He paused before one. The door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted. Inside, the walls were bare, save for an old iron bed frame and a rotted writing desk. Holmes stepped in and knelt by the hearth. There. He reached into the crumbling fireplace and withdrew a scorched scrap of linen. Upon it was the edge of what had once been embroidered letters. Romaine. My breath caught. She was here, I whispered. Holmes nodded. She lived here under the name Claire Redford, and when she died, whether from illness or foul play, someone removed her, buried her elsewhere, and destroyed all remaining traces." He stood and looked about the room. "But not everything burns. She lingered here, in name, in habit, in silence." Back at Baker Street that evening, the fire glowed softly in the hearth, and the long case of notes was finally closed. Holmes opened a drawer and removed the envelope that had once held Vanier's confession, placing within it the torn embroidery fragment. He sealed it carefully and wrote across the front, "Charmaine Ashcroft, her truth." I watched as he placed it in the strongbox where we kept other private resolutions, those mysteries solved not for courtrooms or headlines, but for the dignity of the unseen dead. "She wanted to be found," I said quietly. "And she was," Holmes replied, "not in marble nor in elegy, but in the eyes of those who chose to see her. That, Watson, is the rarest of victories." He turned away then toward the window where the last light of day was fading beyond the rooftops. And so it was that Lady Charmaine Ashcroft, long thought lost to fever and silence, was restored, not to society nor to scandal, but to the truth. At last she had stepped out from behind the shadows of oil and canvas and into the light. The final threads of the case wove themselves together, not with fanfare, but with a quiet grace, as though the truth, long buried beneath decades of silence, had finally exhaled. In the days that followed our visit to the ruined home at St. Jude's, Holmes returned to his violin with a steady hand and composed a brief but striking monograph titled "Art as Evidence, the Vanier Hypothesis," which he submitted anonymously to the Journal of Legal Aesthetics. I myself drafted a more detailed account of the case, though I kept it from public view, uncertain whether the world was ready to hear the full truth as plainly as we had come to know it. It was on an unusually warm April afternoon that the last and most unexpected visitor of the affair arrived at 221B. A soft knock. Mrs. Hudson, curious, showed him in, a boy of about 9 or 10, dressed plainly, but with good manners and the unmistakable air of someone sent on specific instructions. He removed his cap, handed Holmes a sealed envelope, and said only, "It's from the lady. She said you'd know which one." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? And did this lady give a name?" "No, sir, but she had grey eyes and she looked straight through you when she spoke." I started. Holmes, after a moment of pause, gave a faint smile. "Thank you, my boy. Here." He handed the child a shilling, who tipped his cap and left. Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of ivory writing paper, inscribed in a hand that was both old-fashioned and elegant. "Mr. Holmes, I am not Charmaine Ashcroft, but I am her legacy. Her story was not meant to be forgotten, nor twisted into legend. Thank you for seeing her, not as a ghost or a mystery, but as a woman who resisted when resistance was all she had. The portrait is safe now, the rest is silence. Let it be enough." E.R. Holmes folded the letter carefully, placed it into the strongbox beside the others, and said nothing for a time. I broke the silence. "E.R.?" He glanced at me. "There was a niece once removed, Eleanor Redford, distant cousin through the maternal line, born years after Charmaine's disappearance. I'd wager she inherited more than just blood." "You think she's the one who arranged for the painting to be sent to the Institute?" "I do," he said. "The timing matches. The rediscovery of the portrait in the Kent property, the anonymous delivery, the indirect warnings. She wished to bring the truth to light, but feared what might come with it. She tested the waters through Rivington through the painting. When others began to die, she withdrew." I nodded slowly. "But she succeeded?" "She did," he said, "because someone listened." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out over the rooftops as the spring sunlight fell over London like a benediction. The city stirred below us, omnibuses rattling along Baker Street, newsboys shouting the late editions, and the faint music of a barrel organ drifting from the corner. Life, ever unheeding of secrets, continued. But within these rooms something had settled. Later that day I returned to the Marlbrook Institute. Holmes declined to come. He preferred, as he often did, to let the case finish in the minds of others while it had already concluded in his own. Rivington met me just inside the West Hall, his face lit with a kind of peace that had not been there before. "Dr. Watson," he said, "thank you for coming. I thought you might like to see the editions." He led me to the gallery. The exhibition had grown. Lady Charmaine's portrait still held the place of honour, but now, beside it, hung the restored painting of Richard Ashcroft. The tear across his chest had been meticulously repaired. The difference between the two was stark. Charmaine's gaze, calm, quietly brave; Richard's furtive and brooding, as if caught at the edge of a lie. Below the pair, in glass cases, were reproductions of Vanier's letter, the envelope addressed to him, and a page from Miss Prowse's recovered notebook. On one wall, an enlarged version of the inscription Holmes had revealed, Confiteor, had been framed beneath a quote from Michel Vanier. "I did not paint their souls. I painted what they could not say aloud." Visitors stood quietly before the paintings, reading, absorbing. Some lingered, others moved on, subdued. But none left unaffected. As I walked toward the exit, I overheard a girl of about 16 ask her mother, "Did she die because she told the truth?" "No," her mother said softly. "She died because no one was ready to hear it." But someone finally did. I stepped out into the courtyard, the air fragrant with early blossoms, and felt something lift in my chest. Not relief, exactly, but resolution. That evening, back at Baker Street, I found Holmes dozing in his chair, a half-smoked pipe in one hand, and his violin case at his feet. He stirred as I entered, blinking awake. "Well?" he asked. "It's done," I said. "They've made her story part of history." He smiled faintly. "Then she is at peace." A pause. "You know," he added, "of all the voices I've followed through Blood and Cipher and Betrayal, hers was the quietest, and perhaps the most important." I nodded. "Because it was almost lost." "Because it refused to be," he corrected gently. That night I sat by the window in my own quarters, writing the final lines of the case into my journal. And as I laid down my pen, I thought not of the crime or even the justice, but of the eyes in that painting, the ones that watched back, not with judgment, but with endurance. They had waited, through storms and silences, through fire and concealment. And at last, someone had seen. The case of the portrait that watched back was never entered into the official ledgers of Scotland Yard. No medals were handed out, no trial dominated the headlines, but in one gallery in London, the truth hung in oil and varnish, a silent sentinel for all who chose to meet its gaze. And for Sherlock Holmes, whose genius so often lay in dissecting the lies of others, this was a rare moment of listening to the truth whispered, not by the living, but by the painted breath of the long dead. It had been enough. It was nearly a fortnight later, in the first full bloom of May, when the last twist of the case came quietly to our door, not with a bang, but in the form of a parcel, square and bound in red wax, addressed not to Holmes, but to me. Inside was a small, leather-bound volume. Tucked within its front cover was a folded note, written in a hand I now recognized at once. "E.R. Dr. Watson, you wrote about her. I thought it only fair you read her. She began this in secret. Michel Vanier helped her shape it into something coherent. It is not complete, but it is hers. Do what you will with it, but do not let her disappear again. E.R. The book was a diary. The pages were aged but well preserved. And as I began to read, I knew without doubt that it had belonged to Charmaine Ashcroft. She had started the journal mere weeks before her disappearance. Each entry was measured, written in the voice of a woman seeking clarity in the midst of quiet terror. There were descriptions of her growing fear of her husband Richard, of his erratic temper, and of strange visitors he received late at night, men she suspected were blackmailers or worse. There were hints of something deeper, that Richard had been engaged in financial schemes involving stolen artworks, and that she had threatened to go to the authorities. But it was more than fear that filled her writing. There was resolve. One passage stood out, dated the night before her supposed death. I have sent word to Michel. He says he will paint me not as I am feared, but as I truly am. If I am to vanish, let this be my voice. Let someone someday see past the eyes and into the truth. The entries ended there, but it was enough. She had not merely vanished. She had chosen her moment, found her witness, and left behind the only weapon she had, her image, her truth, committed to canvas by a man who saw her not as a wife or possession, but as a soul worth preserving. When I handed the diary to Holmes, he took it with a solemn nod, read several pages in silence, and then placed it atop his bookshelf, just above his monograph on criminal handwriting. "She has spoken now," he said. "With a voice neither forged nor forced, that is the end she earned." The days that followed were quiet. The Marlbrook Institute announced it would be digitizing the Vanier collection, starting with the 2 recovered portraits. A small foundation, named in Miss Evangeline Prowse's honor, was established to support women scholars researching overlooked figures in Victorian art. And Gerard Mornay, no longer hiding behind aliases, faded from public view, disgraced and irrelevant. As for Holmes, he did not speak often of the case, but I caught him more than once glancing at the reproduction of the portrait we had mounted in our sitting room, a modest copy of Lady Charmaine's likeness, gifted to him by the Institute. "Do you suppose," I asked him one evening, "that justice was truly done?" He considered. "Not in the legal sense, perhaps. There was no trial for Richard Ashcroft, no jury for his sins. But justice? Yes. It was done in the only form still possible. She was seen, she was heard, and she is forgotten no longer." I looked at the painting. Even in reproduction it held that same quiet power, that gaze that had once unsettled all who met it, but now offered a kind of calm victory, not triumph, not vengeance, simply truth. And so the case of the portrait that watched back was concluded, not with gallows nor scandal, but with remembrance, a wrong righted not by law, but by listening. A crime answered not with retribution, but with revelation. Sherlock Holmes, who so often found answers in footprints and cigar ash, had in this instance followed the subtlest of trails, brushstrokes, varnish, silence, and found within the canvas of another's pain a truth too long overlooked. And I, who had once stood before that portrait and called it haunting, now understood what it had always been, not haunted, but haunting, a voice, not a ghost, and one that, in the end, had been heard,